You were never supposed to hear this. They didn't build walls to keep the mad inside. They built them to keep the truth from leaking out. In the quiet hills of West Virginia, beneath a fog that never lifts, something was constructed in the 1800s that was never meant to heal, but to hide. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a name buried in history books, softened by tourist brochures, but soaked in blood and silence. They said it was a hospital. They said it was designed for recovery, for light-filled rooms and moral treatment. But from the moment the stones were laid, something else took root. You can feel it before you ever enter. A pressure in the chest, a pulling at the mind. Because this wasn't a place where the insane were healed. It was where the sane were broken, women locked away for loving the wrong man, men disappeared for disagreeing with a sheriff, children born out of wedlock, vanished with no birth certificate, no grave. There were no cameras, no trials, no escape. And once inside, reality twisted. You weren't a person, you were a diagnosis. And the moment ink touched the paper, you stopped existing. They called it therapy, submersion in ice water until muscles stiffened and breath slowed, isolation in steel boxes, small enough to crawl in but never stand. Shock, not to revive, but to erase. And when that didn't work, they took your memories. They shattered them through the eye socket with a slender rod of steel. The lobotomy wasn't a cure. It was a ritual, a sacrifice of self. But the horror didn't end in the treatment rooms, because something else lived beneath the surface. Something built into the stone, something that watched. And as the years passed, patients stopped speaking in pain. They started whispering about the man in the walls. Not a ghost, not a delusion, a presence. You don't have to believe it now. But by the time you've reached the end of this video, you'll understand why men still wake screaming in the night, why the walls of the asylum aren't silent, and why this place didn't just house madness. It created it. Stay with me. Because this is where the descent begins. They said it could hold 250 people. That was the original plan. A quiet place tucked away in the hills, a sanctuary of order for a chaotic mind. But by the 1880s, it held over 2,000. Bodies crammed into rooms meant for a dozen. Voices echoing through endless hallways, and not all of them were mad. Some were sent there for grief, others for alcohol. A woman once locked away for reading novels too often, another for speaking out against her husband. They called it hysteria. They called it disorder. But what they really meant was inconvenient. And once you entered, you didn't leave. No trial, no appeal, no voice, just silence and therapy. But therapy was never meant to heal. They strapped you down in a tub of ice water until your teeth cracked, locked you in a wooden crate the size of a coffin. Days passed, and you forgot what sunlight even felt like. They rewired your brain with electricity, or carved through your skull with instruments more suited for slaughter than science. Lobotomy, the art of subtraction, removing thought, will, memory. But that wasn't the worst part, because the doctors changed too. They started hearing whispers. Nurses began sleepwalking through locked doors. Orderlies refused to go near the West Wing. One man claimed he saw a girl with black eyes standing by the staircase. She vanished when he looked again. He quit the next day, and in one journal, hidden behind a wall panel, a nurse wrote 6 words: "I hear breathing when I'm alone." This wasn't just a hospital gone wrong. It was a trap, a psychic sinkhole. The deeper you went, the more you felt it. A watching, waiting intelligence, older than the brick, older than the land. You think you're just walking through history, but history remembers you. It clings to you. And inside the Trans-Allegheny, nothing ever really leaves, especially not the truth. The blueprints told one story, but the earth beneath the asylum told another. There were tunnels, long corridors carved in stone, hidden beneath the asylum like roots beneath a dead tree. They said they were for coal, for supplies, for moving the dead out of sight. But patients said something else. They said the real treatments happened underground. Men were dragged below after midnight, strapped to stretchers, faces pale, eyes darting like prey. And when, if, they came back, they were hollow, shaking, silent, eyes locked wide open. Even in sleep, one man, Harold Graves, admitted for paranoia, swore the doctors were watching his dreams. He was taken down one night by 2 silent orderlies, never returned. The next morning, a janitor found blood near the tunnel doors. When he asked questions, he was fired, threatened to stay silent, and then he vanished. A nurse named Evelyn once followed the wrong key, opened the wrong door, and saw it. Steel rooms, chains on the walls, a table with restraints, not for surgery, but for something else. She wrote what she saw. Then she disappeared. No transfer, no farewell, just gone. It wasn't science down there. It was theater, the kind that demands blood to make the curtains rise. Some said patients were injected with animal blood, spun in devices until the soul broke loose, left in total darkness for weeks to see what the mind would become. But the most disturbing rumors, the room with 13 iron chairs, bolted in a perfect circle, each one facing a cracked stone wall, each one stained, each one used. Used for what? Nobody ever said, or maybe they did, but their mouths were sewn shut by fear. You feel it, don't you? That tension in your chest, like someone reading your thoughts as you listen. That's not your imagination. That's the beginning of recognition. You're remembering something you've never been told, something that was buried, not in earth, but in time. And now, it's waking up. They called it progress. But down here, it smelled like something ancient. There were no records for what happened underground, no medical logs, no supervision, just silence and screams no one admitted hearing. The experiments weren't about healing. They were about control. Control of the mind, the body, and whatever lives inside a person when you strip everything else away. One woman, Margaret Bell, vanished during the night shift. They said she escaped, but she left no footprints, no personal effects, no paperwork. Her name was scrubbed from the logbook, almost like she'd never existed, except for one note, buried in a nurse's journal, a single sentence. She said the eyes in the tunnels never blink. Eyes? The building had no official lower levels. No blueprints showed anything beneath the main floor. But something was down there. Nurses began quitting in waves. Orderlies walked out mid-shift and never came back. And those who stayed changed. One doctor, Dr. Atherton, became obsessed with the West Wing. He claimed a voice was guiding him. Said he found an opening in the brick behind a supply cabinet. Said it whispered when he was alone. He was found 2 days later, locked inside his office, walls covered in drawings, symbols etched into the wood in his own blood. He'd sewn his mouth shut. No one ever saw him speak again. And yet the administration said nothing. No investigation, no questions. They couldn't afford the truth getting out. Not then, not now. Because what they found beneath the asylum, it wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just madness. It was design. A system built to erase the unwanted, to reshape minds, to strip identity like old paint, until only obedience remained, and it worked. They broke the strong, silenced the defiant, buried those who saw too much. But the walls, they remember. Stone has memory. And what was done in those tunnels never stayed hidden. It waited, and it still waits. For anyone curious enough, brave enough, or foolish enough to look beneath the surface. They didn't just torture the body, they rewired belief, because pain breaks more than bones. It erodes certainty. It collapses the self, and inside the asylum, that was the goal, not to cure, but to fragment, to take people who questioned, who resisted, who saw too much, and grind them down into obedient husks. Empty shells wearing names that no longer fit. One former staffer, known only as R, wrote a letter decades later, smuggled out before the place shut down. It said, they were testing something, not medicine, something older, something that speaks without sound. He described patients placed in copper rooms, rooms with no lights, no sound, only humming. He said they came out hearing voices, speaking in languages they never knew, drawing spirals on the walls with their own blood. It wasn't psychosis. It was ritual. Patterned. Deliberate. These weren't accidents of madness. They were procedures. One diary, recovered during cleanup in the 90s, contained dozens of patient sketches, each one identical. A circle of 13 chairs, always facing a blank wall, always surrounded by crude symbols, stars twisted the wrong way, eyes without pupils. These weren't hallucinations. They were memories, shared by patients who never met, who came from different towns, different years. But all saw the same thing. All described the same presence, the one they called the man in the stone room. Not a doctor, not a ghost. Something else. Some said he had no face. Some said he was made of shadow. Some said he wasn't alone. And every person who drew him either disappeared or died screaming. These aren't just stories. They're symptoms. Symptoms of a system that devours truth, that labels resistance as delusion, and uses the mask of medicine to conceal control, because madness is the perfect prison. No walls, no guards, just doubt. And once you doubt yourself, once they make you question your own mind, they don't have to silence you. You do it for them. There was a technique they never wrote down, a method not taught in medical schools, but passed from doctor to doctor, quietly, privately. They called it the unwinding. It didn't involve scalpels or straps, just time and isolation. The patient was placed alone, no light, no sound, no name, every item of identity removed, clothes replaced with rags, birth names stripped away, no mirrors, no clock, no reflection of the self. Then came the reprogramming. The nurse would enter at random intervals, speak only one sentence, over and over. You are safe here. We are helping you. Day after day, month after month, until the mind cracked and folded in on itself. Some patients forgot how to speak. Some forgot their families. Some forgot their own faces. This wasn't healing, it was erasure. Because if you can erase who a man was, you can rebuild him into anything you want. And the ones who didn't break, they were taken below, down into the stone, where names didn't matter, only obedience. There are letters, hidden in walls, scrawled under floorboards, messages scratched by fingernails into plaster. One reads, "They don't cure us, they remake us." Another, "My thoughts are not my own anymore. I don't remember when they stopped." And another, "They put something in the water." I haven't dreamed in weeks. Just silence. Endless silence. These were not the words of the insane. They were the voices of men and women caught in a machine designed to grind down the soul, to reshape consciousness, to fracture will, and mold a new order beneath the banner of medicine. What if I told you the asylum was never about madness? What if I told you it was a prototype, an experiment in social control, hidden behind locked doors and doctors' titles, a laboratory for breaking the human spirit, long before they tried it in the outside world? Because this place wasn't just a building, it was a blueprint, and we've been living in the structure ever since. You think this is history, but it isn't just the past. Trans-Allegheny was never isolated. It was integrated, connected to universities, funded by unseen hands, protected by silence that only power can buy. Because when you want to reshape society, you don't start with the masses. You start with the outliers. The ones who think differently, feel too deeply, see too much. You remove them, call them unstable, label them defective, then study them. And once you learn how to fracture the rebel, you scale it. What worked inside the asylum was brought outside its walls. Education systems that standardize, media that numbs, pharmaceuticals for every emotion, surveillance disguised as safety. They learned it all here, in a place that was never about healing. It was about filtering, separating the obedient from the inconvenient, and erasing those who didn't conform. One former inspector, anonymously published in a forgotten paper, wrote this: Trans-Allegheny is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. It does not fail to heal. It succeeds in destroying. He went missing 2 months later. His family was told he drowned. His body was never recovered, because some truths are too corrosive. They don't just challenge the narrative, they destroy it. And if you speak them out loud, the system doesn't debate you. It deletes you. Just like it did to Margaret Bell. Just like it did to Elijah Rowe. Just like it did to anyone who saw the tunnels, heard the humming, felt the presence behind the walls. This isn't just about a haunted asylum. It's about how easily truth becomes a threat, and how the tools of healing can be sharpened into weapons of control. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you questioned the label they gave you, the prescription they handed you, the story they told you about what's normal? Because if they could erase the minds of 2,000 people in a single building, what do you think they're doing to millions today? And if that scares you, good. It means you're waking up. They say the walls talk in that place, but they're wrong. The walls don't talk. They remember. Stone doesn't forget pain. It absorbs it. And after decades of screams, isolation, electric shocks, broken minds, the walls began to breathe. Visitors still report it today, a heaviness in the chest as soon as they enter, like the building itself is watching, measuring. Tour guides speak of sudden temperature drops, voices in empty rooms, footsteps following them down halls with no one there. But those are just echoes. The real horror is deeper, because something still lives in the basement. Paranormal teams call it an entity. Locals call it the Hollow Man. But those who've seen it say it doesn't walk. It drags. A black shape, faceless, featureless. But when it gets close, you hear your own name whispered back to you, in your voice. What kind of presence can mimic your soul? Is it just trauma echoing through time? Or is it something else? In 1976, a psychiatric intern claimed he found a sealed room behind a bricked-up hallway. Inside, a chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by mirrors. He said he saw something moving behind the glass, but there was no reflection. When he told his supervisor, he was sent on mandatory leave. His medical license was revoked the same year. He died by suicide 5 months later. The chair is still there. People who sit in it claim to feel watched, as if they're not alone. Even when the room is empty, one visitor scratched a message into the chair's armrest before fleeing. I saw myself, but it wasn't me. That's what the asylum does. It doesn't haunt you like a ghost story. It infiltrates. It crawls beneath your skin, whispers doubt into your mind, and waits for the cracks to form. Because once you start questioning what's real, you've already started to fall, and the ones who fall, they don't always come back up. There's a reason they took away your name. Inside the asylum, identity was the first to go. Once stripped of that, you became something else, something easier to mold. They called you by numbers, referred to you as subject or case, and slowly you stopped correcting them because the brain needs anchors, names, memories, meaning, and when those are gone, you drift. That was the point. They didn't want to just break the body. They wanted to rupture the soul. In 1885, a doctor named Silas Went kept a private journal, never meant to be published, found in the walls after the building closed. One entry reads, "The moment they forget their own name, the mind opens, like a door, and something enters." He never says what, but over a dozen entries reference the shadow behind the eyes, and the voice that answers when no one speaks. This wasn't medicine. It was invocation, using trauma, isolation, and identity loss as ritual mechanisms to invite something in. He wrote about patients who began speaking backwards, ones who could predict visitors before they arrived, and one man, listed only as patient 43, who stopped sleeping entirely. They opened his cell and found every inch of the walls covered in writing, not English, not Latin, unknown symbols carved with fingernails. When asked what it meant, he said, "I wrote what it told me, so I wouldn't forget who I am." He died a week later. Eyes open, body frozen stiff, still pointing to a symbol scratched above his bed. That symbol matched the ones found in the tunnel chairs, the ones drawn by different patients across different decades, all identical. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a message. But the question is, from who? And more importantly, why? Because if madness was just chaos, it wouldn't leave patterns. But Trans-Allegheny is full of patterns, and patterns point to design, which means this wasn't just a failure of care. It was a system engineered, not to treat, but to unmake. One man arrived in 1891, a soldier, decorated, respected, committed for what they called agitated hallucinations. His name was Major Lennox. He said he'd seen something during combat, something that followed him home, not in his dreams, but in the corners of rooms, in reflections that moved when he didn't. They diagnosed him as paranoid, locked him in the Eastern Wing. Within 2 weeks, he stopped eating, stopped speaking, started drawing. Symbols, again, circles, spirals, eyes without pupils. A black shape looming behind crude sketches of himself. The nurses called it Lennox's madness. But one day, he vanished, gone from his locked room, no broken window, no sign of escape, just a single phrase scratched into the mirror with a shard of glass. It found a door. That phrase would return again and again, scrawled on ceilings, carved into the backs of wooden chairs, written in blood on the inside of patient shirts. It found a door. But a door to what? Some said it was just psychosis, mass suggestion, a delusion shared between fragile minds. But then staff started seeing things too. A nurse fled the building after seeing herself walking down the hallway. Same face, same uniform, but the eyes were wrong. A groundskeeper quit after finding graves behind the building he didn't dig. He said they hummed. He said he felt pulled toward them. And in the sealed west wing, long abandoned, a visitor caught a photo through the crack in the rusted door. It showed what looked like 13 chairs, in a circle, all facing a single black wall. He never went back, said he started dreaming in a voice that wasn't his, and that's when the question shifted. It wasn't what happened to the patients. It became, what did they become? Because if identity can be erased, and the mind can be broken open, what might come through that crack? What if Trans-Allegheny wasn't just a house for the mad, but a gateway? And what if the door is still open? You've made it this far. That alone means something. Most people look away. They tap out when the truth gets heavy, when the cracks start forming inside their certainty. But you're still here, listening, feeling it crawl beneath your skin. So I'll tell you what they never wanted you to hear. Trans-Allegheny wasn't a failure. It was a filter, a place to identify the minds that could not be controlled, and either erase them or use them. Some were broken, some were silenced, but a few, a very few, were opened, not destroyed, transformed. These were the ones who came back from the tunnels with eyes that didn't blink, with voices that spoke in doubles, with knowledge they couldn't explain. Doctors called it regression, but others knew better. One inmate wrote, "I have seen behind the skin of the world, and the face beneath it is smiling." They weren't delusional, they were changed, and now you face the same threshold, because if you followed the symbols, heard the echoes, felt the unease, you're no longer just a viewer, you're in it. So here's the choice. You can forget what you've heard, write it off as story, as legend, as madness, or you can claim what few dare to claim, your mind, your will, your awakening. If you're ready, if you want to see what they buried beneath the stone in silence, type the phrase below in the comments twice. I remember who I was before the silence. I remember who I was before the silence. Say it, write it, seal it. This isn't just a video, it's a threshold. And once you cross it, you don't go back, because now we go deeper, past the rituals, past the records, into the blood-soaked heart of something older than the asylum itself. Stay close. The next door is opening. They said it was built on limestone, solid ground, stable foundation, but they never told you what was buried beneath it long before the asylum, before the Civil War, before a single brick was laid. This land was cursed. The Shawnee refused to settle here, called it the place of hollow wind, said the ground hummed at night, said voices echoed through trees even when no one spoke. They didn't build on it. They circled it, marked it with stones, burial mounds, aligned in perfect spirals, symbols etched into the earth like warnings. The settlers ignored them, called it superstition, and built the asylum right on top. But some wounds aren't healed by stone and iron. They're deep, psychic, alive. From the moment construction began, men started disappearing. One worker went into the foundation to retrieve tools, never came back. They found his lantern still burning, sitting beside a hole no one remembered digging. They sealed it with concrete. But the humming got louder. Another mason, Liam Callahan, started carving symbols into the bricks. When the foreman asked why, he said, "This place bends thought. I'm trying to keep the walls from breathing." He was found hanging in the rafters a week later, but that's not the part they recorded. His eyes were missing, and above his body, carved deep into the beam, was a spiral. The same spiral drawn by patients 30 years later. The same spiral seen in the tunnel chairs, in the notebooks, on the skin of the dead. This wasn't a coincidence. This was design. The asylum wasn't a hospital that went wrong. It was a structure built over something ancient, something buried but not dead, a conduit, not for healing but for feeding. It fed on grief, on silence, on the madness of those who no longer remembered who they were. And the deeper they went, the stronger it became. Now ask yourself, what kind of system builds a sanctuary on top of a scar? And what exactly was it trying to awaken? Buildings have blueprints, but some have geometry, not math, not structure, but intention. Trans-Allegheny wasn't just assembled, it was aligned. Every hallway, every wing, measured against ancient patterns. The central tower was built over the deepest point in the land, directly above where the burial mounds once stood. Some say that's coincidence, but when you study the floor plan, it matches something else, a symbol from the Eleusinian Mysteries, an old Greek ritual site for contacting the dead. 13 corridors, forming a spiral from the inside out, ending in a central void. The same shape found carved into Celtic tombs, the same one drawn by patients in the 1880s. Even though they'd never seen it before, they weren't inventing it. They were remembering it. Dr. Atherton, the same man who later cut out his own tongue, once gave a private lecture to visiting physicians. In it, he said, "Insanity is not always illness. Sometimes it's proximity to the divine." That recording was never published, but transcripts surfaced years later. He described the asylum as a tuning fork, a device to open the mind, not for healing, but for contact. Contact with what? He didn't say. But he used the word threshold 6 times in 5 minutes, and warned that once crossed, some minds do not return intact. By 1899, staff were forbidden from entering certain rooms alone, not for safety, but because the layout began changing. Doors wouldn't stay where they belonged. Hallways would stretch too far. One nurse walked for 40 minutes and never found the exit. She came back barefoot, muttering about a room made of mirrors. She was discharged, no explanation, but in her report, she drew the same spiral and wrote one word beneath it: opened. So now we ask, was the asylum designed to confine madness, or was it built to summon it? And if it was a ritual, then who or what was it built to serve? We've been taught to fear madness, to run from it, to cage it. But what if madness wasn't failure? What if it was a doorway? Because inside Trans-Allegheny, madness didn't look random. It looked structured. People who had never met spoke the same phrases, drew the same symbols, described the same figure watching from the dark. That's not chaos. That's transmission. You don't get identical delusions from disconnected minds unless something is being received. Over time, doctors noticed patterns. Certain patients only broke after being housed in specific rooms, rooms closest to the sublevels, rooms with copper in the walls. That copper wasn't an accident. It's used in circuits, in energy conduits, and in ancient ritual chambers. Copper doesn't just conduct electricity, it amplifies presence. And beneath those rooms, the tunnels, the ones where patients were taken at night, returned days later, quiet, eyes too wide. Some never returned at all. Officially, those disappearances were chalked up to escape, but there were no exit points, no breach, no stolen clothes, no footsteps in the snow, just silence. And in that silence, something else grew. One nurse, later institutionalized herself, said she heard the building whispering, not in words, but in feeling. She said it wanted less thinking, more receiving. As if the asylum itself had become aware, tired of its role, eager to evolve. What if that wasn't insanity? What if it was transformation? Every ritual demands a cost, and every gateway needs a vessel. What better vessel than a fractured mind, empty enough to hold something else? They didn't cure patients here. They emptied them, hollowed them, rewired them, until something stepped in, something old, something hungry, and the terrifying part? It didn't always leave. Every system tells you it's here to help, that it exists for your safety, your progress, your well-being. But Trans-Allegheny proved the opposite, because once you strip away the forms, the charts, the white coats, you're left with something else. A machine, not built to heal, but to erase. And like any machine, it was cold, efficient, hungry. There are reports, hidden in archived state files, of patients who didn't deteriorate, but changed. They spoke less, slept less, started mimicking the staff. One nurse claimed a patient had taken on her voice, her mannerisms, even knew her father's name. When she confronted him, he smiled and said, "You left the door open." He was transferred to the lower ward, where records end. Another case, patient number 722, drew schematics of the asylum from memory, blueprints he should never have seen, accurate down to sealed-off stairwells that had been bricked for decades. When asked how he knew, he said, The building told me. It likes me now. These weren't breakdowns. They were integrations. Whatever was inside that place, it didn't destroy identity. It consumed it, merged with it, and over time, it began to spread. Staff started acting strangely. Nurses reported seeing their own faces in the mirror. Blink before they did. A doctor wrote in his resignation, "I don't know if I'm still me. Something is wearing me." He burned all his files before disappearing. No body was ever found. This isn't just about mental collapse. It's about replacement. What if the goal wasn't to break minds, but to open them just wide enough for something else to get in? What if that something still lives inside the walls, inside the blueprints, inside people? You've seen it, haven't you? In systems that promise care, but deliver control. In institutions that speak of help, but feed on your compliance. It didn't start with the asylum, but that's where the mask began to slip. And now, it's everywhere. Stop. Take a breath. Because this isn't just history anymore. You're not watching a story. You're walking through it. This place, Trans-Allegheny, it was never just an asylum. It was a prototype. A map of how to break a human mind, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but obedience, or something waiting to take its place. Now ask yourself something dangerous. How many pieces of your mind are truly yours? How many thoughts were planted? How many fears were taught? And how many voices in your head don't actually belong to you? We are told madness is random, but madness, real madness, is often the result of pressure, applied slowly, strategically, from birth. You are taught what is normal, what is rational, what is correct. But who wrote those definitions? Who decided that grief is a disorder? That questioning authority is paranoia? That seeing patterns is delusion? The same system that put women in cages for reading books now tells you what's acceptable thought. That should terrify you, because Trans-Allegheny may have closed its doors. But the walls, the ideology, still stand. The modern world has no need for stone asylums when screens, pills, algorithms, and diagnosis codes do the same job. You're not strapped to a gurney. You're distracted. You're not drugged into silence. You're entertained into obedience. You're not locked in a cell. You're caged by your own beliefs, ones they gave you. And here's the real horror. You might already be living in an asylum, one without bars, one that calls itself freedom, but thrives on your disconnection from yourself. And when that disconnection gets too wide, they call it a condition. They prescribe you something and label you with letters and numbers as if the soul can be diagnosed. This was never about healing. It was about harvesting. And now that you've seen it, truly seen it, you can't go back. And, oh, if you've made it this far, comment. The mirror is broken. The mirror is broken. Twice. To awaken the others. To mark that you've passed through the threshold. Because once you see the pattern, you never unsee it. They want you to believe it's over. That what happened in the 1800s was primitive, a relic of the past. That we've evolved. But evolution doesn't mean progress. It means adaptation. And the darkness that once wore blood-soaked gowns and surgical restraints now wears suits. It speaks in funding reports, clinical trials, ethics boards, but the game hasn't changed. Only the costume. Because the same techniques, isolation, erasure, mental fragmentation, have simply been digitized. Your anxiety, monetized. Your confusion, measured. Your pain, categorized and sold back to you as a subscription. They used to call it hysteria. Now they call it disorder. And just like Trans-Allegheny, the treatment doesn't liberate you. It tames you. Suppress the symptoms, ignore the cause, move on. But the root remains, rotting, festering, beneath the surface, like those tunnels. Remember them? They didn't fill them in. They just sealed the doors. And that's what they've done to your mind. They seal away what's inconvenient. They medicate the rebellion. They punish the pattern recognizers. And when that doesn't work, they pathologize truth. The man who said the walls were watching, he was locked up. The woman who saw rituals under the floors, lobotomized. Now imagine what would happen today. If you started questioning the programming, the structure, the authority, you'd be drowned in noise, flagged by algorithms, diagnosed by strangers who've never looked into your eyes, because you're not supposed to awaken, you're supposed to comply. Trans-Allegheny wasn't a failure of the system, it was the blueprint. Break them, study them, discard them, and then pretend it never happened. That's how they operate, through silence, through amnesia, through normalization of the horrific. But here's the fracture point. You're remembering now. Not just this story, but something deeper. A sense that things aren't right, that your instincts weren't wrong, that your discomfort is a compass, not a curse. And once enough men remember, the asylum can no longer hold, because when the silence is broken, the walls start to crumble, and the truth starts to rise. There was one room inside Trans-Allegheny they never spoke of in public records. No photographs, no blueprints, no mention in any inspection or funding request. But it existed, buried beneath the East Wing, past the medical wards, behind a door that didn't open with any ordinary key. They called it the listening room, and no one knows who gave it that name. Some say it was a nickname whispered by nurses. Others claimed it was once engraved on a brass plate, long since removed, but every patient who entered came back changed, if they came back at all. One janitor, a man named Calvin Briggs, kept a private log, recovered decades later during demolition. He wrote, "They say it's used for calming, but the patients scream louder coming out than they ever did going in. One girl clawed her own face trying to block the sound. Another sat perfectly still, humming the same 4 notes for 72 hours. There's something down there, something that listens back." He tried to report it. He vanished 3 days later. And what did this room contain? Not chains, not blades, not even restraints. Just a chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by copper walls, a ceiling lined with mirrors. No straps were needed, because something else held them in place. They say the air vibrated in that room, that your thoughts started echoing, not in your head, but around the walls, a perfect crucible for collapse, because this wasn't treatment, it was resonance, a study in how far a soul can stretch before it snaps. Some said it was early sound therapy, others believed it was something far darker, an early attempt at psychic fracture, a prototype for acoustic control. But in the margins of an intern's notebook, one sentence chills the blood. The sound isn't created, it's summoned, like something ancient is being fed vibrations, and it speaks back. But not in words. Madness, maybe, but here's the question. Why was the listening room the first space they destroyed? Before the ink on the shutdown order even dried, what were they afraid someone might find? There's a reason certain institutions were built the way they were, not just for function, but for containment. Look at Trans-Allegheny's architecture. The long corridors, the echo chambers, the impossible angles of the East Wing. It wasn't just design. It was intention. An early patient, a surveyor named Jonathan Keel, wrote in his diary, "The building pulls you in. No matter where you start, you always end up at the same place, the center, as if it wants you there. He wasn't hallucinating. Modern architects later discovered the entire structure forms a geometric pattern, a symbol hidden in plain sight, not just for aesthetics, but for energy. Some believe the asylum was built on a convergence point, a location where electromagnetic fields naturally spike, where the veil between thought and reality thins, and that the structure itself was a machine, not to cure madness, but to provoke it, an early experiment in what we now call psychogeometry, the shaping of space to shape the mind. Inside those walls, the weak unraveled, the strong bent, and those who resisted too long vanished. But here's the part they buried deeper than the tunnels. The funding, because behind the state charters and health boards, there was another name on the financial records, the St. Alban Foundation. On the surface, just a group of wealthy benefactors, but trace the names and they lead to private councils, closed-door societies, families connected to eugenics programs, occult research, and early government psychological operations. Why would they care about a rural asylum in West Virginia, unless it wasn't just an asylum, unless it was a prototype, a test run for something larger? What if Trans-Allegheny was a controlled experiment to find the limits of psychological manipulation, to study the collapse of identity and how to trigger transformation in the human mind? Because once you can break a person, you can reshape them, not just into something compliant, but into something useful. By the late 1890s, Trans-Allegheny was no longer just an asylum. It had become a proving ground, and what they were testing wasn't medicine. It was obedience. Patterns emerged in the records. Certain patients were selected for something called Phase 2, no explanation, no outcome listed, just a date and then silence. But weeks later, those same patients returned to the general population. Different, calm, disciplined, no longer resisting. One former nurse, who only signed her letters as R, said this: "They don't scream anymore. They wait, they follow orders. Even when the orders are wrong, something's been drilled into them, something deeper than fear." It wasn't treatment, it was training, and it wasn't just the patients. Staff turnover rose sharply during those years, but no public complaints, no lawsuits, no paper trail, because replacements were coming from somewhere else. Men with no medical background, no family records, but full access to every room, even the sub-levels. They worked late, asked no questions, and when they spoke, their voices sounded flat, too precise, like they were reading from inside their own skulls. Visitors noticed it too. They described an atmosphere that felt programmed, a silence that wasn't natural, like the entire building was holding its breath. Here's where it turns, because hidden in a box of unfiled memos from 1901 was a single unsigned report. It read, "Subject 47 shows signs of total compliance, post-stimulus, exposure to Phase 2 complete, recommend extension to non-clinical population, Trans-Allegheny Protocol scalable." Scalable. That word changes everything. It means this wasn't meant to stay inside those walls. This was a template, a model for something bigger, nationwide, maybe global. And what was Phase 2? That remains redacted. But if compliance was the goal, then madness wasn't a failure. It was a necessary step. Break the mind, rebuild the self, create a new obedience, one that doesn't question, doesn't remember, only serves. Everything leads back to the protocol, not the therapy, not the institution, but the system underneath it. Trans-Allegheny was never about healing. It was about refinement, sharpening a formula so precise it could turn chaos into control. And behind it all, one name kept reappearing in the background, never in the patient files, never in the public grants, but always just beneath the surface. A man called Dr. Alaric Voss. You won't find him in your school books. His records were purged. Even his death was never certified. But inside a hidden annex of the asylum, one journal remained, tattered, half-burned, stained with something dark. He wrote, "Obedience is not taught. It is installed, layer by layer, fear, isolation, then reward, until the soul rewrites itself." He believed the mind could be recoded, like a machine, and he wasn't working alone. References inside his journal point to meetings held off-site. Sessions with the circle. Always capitalized, no names, just symbols, a triangle inside a ring, a spiral of 7 marks. And then this entry. The circle has approved Phase 3, subjects outside the asylum, unaware, unprepared, perfect. Let that sink in. They moved beyond the walls. They took what worked on the broken and applied it to the everyday, subliminal obedience, emotional instability, media that triggers constant unrest, an education system that rewards memorization over insight, everything designed to keep your mind pliable. Dr. Voss predicted it clearly. The asylum is no longer a building, it is a culture. He was right. Look around. The same techniques used in those stone halls, isolation, sensory overload, gaslighting, dehumanization, they are everywhere now, in your screen, in your workplace, in your schools. The only difference, there are no bars, because the new asylum doesn't need them. When you control perception, you don't need chains, you only need belief. What if I told you the asylum never closed? That its walls simply expanded, its methods refined, its reach global. You see, the bricks are gone, but the blueprint remains, rewritten into systems you trust, institutions you defend, screens you scroll. Phase 3 wasn't an end, it was an integration. Dr. Voss and the Circle didn't just want obedience inside one building, they wanted it everywhere, without resistance, without awareness. So they studied the triggers. Silence, noise, sleep deprivation, shame. They learned which ones eroded the self and which ones rebuilt it in their image. Then they mirrored those effects in public life. They created environments of constant judgment, endless distraction, false choices. They trained people to police themselves, to silence their own doubt, to laugh at anyone who asked too many questions, because ridicule is the new straitjacket and fear is the new lobotomy. They didn't need to drag bodies into basements anymore. They just had to trap the mind. And once the mind is broken enough, it becomes useful, obedient to authority, addicted to routine, terrified of isolation, willing to trade freedom for belonging. Congratulations. You've just described the modern citizen. The very traits that were once considered madness are now built into the structure of daily life. Think about it. How many times have you felt like something was wrong, but you said nothing, did nothing? Because speaking would isolate you, expose you, mark you. That's not freedom. That's programming. That's Phase 3. It doesn't chain your body, it chains your identity, until you forget you were ever free. But here's the danger. Some minds don't break. Some remember. Some see the pattern in the noise, the outline beneath the mask. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You're no longer part of the asylum. You're outside it. And that makes you dangerous. So I'll ask you now, if you're still with me, comment this phrase twice. Lock it in. Signal your awakening. The walls were never real. Type it twice below. Let the algorithm know you're one of us. They always say the truth will set you free, but what they never tell you is, first, it will break you, because once you realize how deep the program runs, how carefully your reality was constructed, You start questioning everything, your history, your beliefs, your identity, all shaped inside an invisible system of control. Trans-Allegheny was the prototype. But today, the structure is digital, the corridors are code, the lobotomy comes through screens, repetition, endless opinions that sound like truth, until your own voice goes silent. They replace chains with trends, drugs with dopamine loops, and cages with algorithms. You're being medicated every time you scroll, every time you nod along, every time you conform without knowing why. This is the new psychiatry. And the diagnosis is dissent. But here's the paradox, the ones they labeled mad. They were often the most awake. Margaret Bell, Elijah Rowe, Isabel Carter. They weren't broken, they were threats. Threats to a system that cannot survive independent thought, that fears any mind that can't be conditioned. That's why the circle hid their work beneath institutions. That's why the tunnels existed, not just to imprison, but to refine techniques before deploying them on society at large. And the irony, most people volunteered for the modern asylum. They walk in willingly, smiling, performing, begging for approval, never asking who built the stage. But not you. If you're still here, still listening, it means something and you refuse sedation. Maybe it was a dream, a doubt, a fracture in the illusion. Everything designed to control you follows a pattern. And once you see that pattern, you hold the key. It begins with isolation, not physical, but psychological. They disconnect you from inner truth, from instinct, from sovereignty. Then they create dependency on approval, on comfort, on external validation. They teach you to question yourself. Before you ever question the system, this is the blueprint, refined over centuries, perfected in places like Trans-Allegheny, and deployed globally without anyone noticing. The architecture of control always looks different, but feels the same. An asylum, a classroom, an office, a screen. The walls change, the purpose doesn't. Contain, reform, repurpose, and above all, silence. Because truth, real truth, cannot be allowed to spread. It's not just dangerous, it's viral. They knew if even one patient found their center, if even one soul refused to be broken, that resistance could spread through the collective. That's why the worst punishments weren't for violence, but for clarity, for writing, for remembering, for waking up. It's why Margaret vanished, why Elijah was burned, why the nurse wrote her final letter in blood under the floorboards. Not because they were mad, but because they remembered who they were. So what do you do now? Now that you remember too? Here's the unspoken law of their system. Control only works if you consent to it, and consent can be withdrawn, quietly, without permission, without noise. The moment you stop reacting, stop complying, stop believing. The moment you ask who benefits, who profits, who builds these walls around your mind, that's the moment the asylum starts to crack. Because power doesn't fear rebellion. It fears awareness, and awareness is a virus. One patient, one listener, one awakened soul is all it takes. You're not just a viewer anymore. You're the glitch. You're the threat. You're the beginning of collapse. This is the final threshold. Everything you've heard was never meant to reach you. Not through textbooks, not through tours, not through polite conversations about history. You've walked deeper than most ever dare. And now you know, the asylum wasn't an exception. It was a mirror, a blueprint for control, tested in brick and blood, then expanded into laws, into systems, into the culture itself. They silenced the inconvenient, not with bullets, but with diagnoses, not with cages, but with language. They called truth, delusion, awareness, paranoia, rebellion, insanity. And with that trick, they rewrote reality. What happened behind those asylum walls never really ended. It simply changed costumes. Now the restraints are invisible, the torture is legal, and the silence is self-imposed. But here's what they fear, not revolution, not violence. They fear the man who sees, who reads between the headlines, who notices the patterns, who questions what they call fact. Because once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. You begin to move differently, speak differently, think like a ghost walking among the blind. They can't sedate that, can't medicate it. can't cage it without exposing the very lie they built the world upon. And that's why the descent matters, because what you found here isn't just history, it's prophecy. The walls you pass every day are no different from the ones that held Margaret Bell or Elijah Rowe, or the voices still whispering through cracked stone and rusted doors. The ghosts are real, not because of superstition, but because injustice leaves echoes. And when you finally hear them, you become one of them, not haunted, but awakened. The truth doesn't scream, it waits, it watches.